that places the burden on Palestinian journalists inside the Gaza Strip. At least 116 have already been killed overall in the conflict, but the vast majority are Palestinians in Gaza, many of whom who are still working now are working with family members who have been killed, struggling through a famine, struggling through the most unimaginable circumstances, and are still working to get the story out.
Nada Bashir is an award-winning international correspondent for CNN. She's based at the network's London bureau, but we have the pleasure of having her in studio here in New York. Nada, thanks so much for stopping by.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, I should say you did not travel from London just for us. You were at the Emmys last night, and you won an Emmy.
I did.
Which is well-deserved because
Thank you.
I've been watching your coverage, and you're one of the sharpest and I think most thoughtful correspondents covering the Middle East. So I think it's very well-deserved, and congratulations.
Thank you so much.
I want to get into your career and everything and a bunch of different topics, but I want to start with the sort of breaking news from the Middle East. The United States is pushing for a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. Israel has waged a bombing campaign in southern Lebanon, and it's made it so that yesterday was the deadliest day in Lebanon since the civil war, which ended in 1990. We're on the brink of potential real war here. Could you tell us from your perspective what is going on, what the situation on the ground is, and what the context for this is?
I mean, we've been talking for months now about the potential for a spillover of the war in Gaza, of the potential for a broader regional war. We've been hearing those warnings and those alarm bells being sounded, and there has been real concern, of course, over the escalation that we've been seeing on Lebanon's southern border over the last few months. But there is a real sense of fear and urgency now around what's happening as we see Israel deepening its attacks on Lebanese territory in Beirut now, as we're seeing hundreds of thousands of civilians essentially being forced out of their homes in the south for their own safety and protection, as there are fears of a potential ground incursion by the Israeli military. And the real concern here is, of course, we've seen what's happened in Gaza over the last now almost a year, and there has been that repeated call for a ceasefire, a repeated call for a pause in violence in Gaza, and those calls haven't been heeded. And now, as you mentioned, we're hearing calls for a temporary ceasefire along Lebanon's southern border. But whether or not that can be agreed to, whether or not there is any room for diplomacy, is a real concern, because that simply hasn't been the case with Gaza. We've only seen an escalation, in fact.
Yeah, and I think it requires an appetite for diplomacy on either side, which has thus far apparently been absent. You've been at the forefront of coverage for CNN of this crisis from Gaza to Israel to the West Bank to Lebanon now. What was your first assignment covering all of this after October 7th?
Well, my first assignment was to head straight to the UAE to attempt to get on an aid flight to Gaza's border with Egypt. Of course, at that point, it was perhaps the first week of the war, and so there were hopes that there would be access for journalists to get in via the Rafah border crossing. That obviously wasn't the case. It still isn't the case. We can't get in, unfortunately. And from that point, once we realised we wouldn't be able to get into Gaza, we moved on to the occupied West Bank and focused there. So from there, we were obviously reporting on what was happening inside Gaza. We also spent some time in Jordan reporting on the huge protests that were taking place, anti-war protests. But I think what was so crucial for us and for my team in the West Bank was also to shed light on what was happening there, because what we've seen over the course of the war in Gaza is a huge escalation in violence targeting Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, sort of behind the fog of war almost, a level of impunity that has only been really exacerbated and extended over the course of the war. And what we've seen, not only from our own reporting, but according to human rights organizations as well as Israeli human rights organizations, is a real surge in violence against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. We've seen an expansion of settlements, which are considered by many to be illegal under international law, and that continues to be that concern around that rise in settler violence against Palestinians. So that was a huge portion of the story, and it's so deeply linked to what is happening in Gaza. And I think people really overlook that and almost forget that the conflict that we're seeing in Gaza is so connected to what we see in the West Bank that you can't ignore one or the other.
I want to get to Gaza, but some of your, I think, most important reporting has been focused on the West Bank. What did you see there, and what was the story that you did about the occupied West Bank?
Well, a lot of our work in the occupied West Bank focused on the expansion of settlements there. We spent a lot of time in the southern Hebron Hills around communities that were essentially being forced out because of the rampant violence that they had been seeing and experiencing. So we're talking about homes being torched and demolished. We're talking about violence targeting civilians, people, families and children, people essentially being driven out of fear. And what we also saw during that time in the early few months of the war was essentially a rise in violence because many settlers had been almost emboldened by support from the Israeli military, by the Israel Defense Forces. So what we'd seen, and according to many human rights organizations who have been tracking this, is settlers carrying out violent attacks with IDF soldiers right behind them, essentially allowing them to do so. So that was one of the key focuses of our sort of reporting there. And we also obviously looked at the IDF raids that were taking place. That has only increased. We've seen that in recent weeks, of course, in parts of Jenin and Tulkarm. It's only getting worse, and that was really important for us to shed light on.
What's your experience when you're covering a story like this with the Israeli government? Have they been forthcoming? Are they easy to work with? How has that aspect been played out?
I mean, you have the Israeli government and the Israeli military spokespeople on that level, and then you have, of course, the Israeli military on the ground who oftentimes would try to stop us from filming. We were detained temporarily while we were filming, accused of things that we weren't involved in.
What were you accused of?
We were accused of taking part in a protest that we hadn't even been at. You know, we had falsified photos taken of us, you know, accusations that weren't correct, and eventually we were let go. But you know, there are challenges when you're filming on the ground, when you're reporting on the ground, and there are parts of the story that maybe the Israeli military, the Israeli government doesn't want you to see, and it was important for us to shed light on that. So that was hugely important for us, and we were doing that alongside Israeli organizations and Israeli human rights organizations who also wanted to shed light on what was happening in the occupied West Bank. But then again, you have the spokespeople as well. We've had direct attacks from Israeli military spokespeople on CNN's air, you know, targeting and attacking our reporting as well. So that's a challenge that we have to face as well. And of course, our reporting is always based on fact. It's always very rigorous. But again, with any country that you're dealing with any state, you have to deal with sort of the state narrative as well. Yeah. And not always the government won't be forthcoming.
Now, you haven't reported from Gaza. Why is that?
So there is no access independently to the Gaza Strip for journalists, for media workers. There have been embeds with the Israeli military. They are very restricted, very limited in terms of who gets to go in, how long you spend there, what you get to see. So my colleagues, Jeremy Diamond has been in quite a few times now to the Gaza Strip and has taken part in those embeds. Clarissa Ward has also gone in independently, actually. She managed to get in with an aid group, but again, only for a matter of hours. And there has been this continued push from organizations, including CNN, to get access to Gaza because it's so crucial for our reporting. But there just hasn't been any movement really from the Israeli military, from the Israeli government in allowing journalists in. And this is, I mean, it's almost unheard of, you know, particularly a state which claims to be democratic, to completely prevent journalists and international media workers from getting in. And of course, that places the burden on Palestinian journalists inside the Gaza Strip. At least 116 have already been killed overall in the conflict, but the vast majority are Palestinians in Gaza, many of whom who are still working now are working with family members who have been killed, struggling through a famine, struggling through the most unimaginable circumstances, and are still working to get the story out.
Yeah, so how does a network like CNN, which obviously has an incredibly impressive international reporting operation, is not allowed into Gaza, how does CNN get news out of Gaza?
Well, we're very, very lucky to have incredible colleagues on the ground in Gaza, Palestinian photojournalists who spend every day, morning till night, documenting what is happening, following the latest strikes, following the latest catastrophes, wherever it might be, following those hotspots. And they are risking their lives, and their work is brave and it's tireless, and we rely so much on their work, on the footage that they bring in. And then we spend hours sort of trawling through this often horrifying footage and trying to build a story out of that to paint a picture of what is happening. On the ground. And then of course we have our colleagues in Jerusalem as well who spend a lot of time connecting with people inside Gaza, with people inside the occupied West Bank as well. So without them we really wouldn't be able to do the work that we're doing. But of course everyone has access to this footage now on social media as well.
Yeah, it's a different landscape than it used to be. When you speak to them, these photojournalists that you work with, what's their experience been like? Is that hard to cope with the fact that they're under extraordinary, I'd say almost unprecedented, at least in modern history, circumstances.
It is, I mean, it's hard to put into words what they're seeing and experiencing on a daily basis. I mean, they're working while fearing for the lives of their children, of their parents, of their siblings. They are living in very difficult circumstances, many of them, of course, living in tents, in temporary shelters, struggling with the technical issues of actually trying to get the footage to us as well. That's a huge challenge. But the things that they've seen, not just our colleagues at CNN, but other journalists that you hear from inside Gaza, the things that they have seen and witnessed, no one, I mean, it's unimaginable to be able to cope with sort of seeing that. I mean, I look at some of the footage that comes in, and it's difficult for me to see. And now I still think about, you know, specific bits of footage that I've seen that really stay with me and are awful. And to have to witness that in real life every single day for a year, I mean, the toll that takes on a person is unimaginable.
Right. Now, this has been the deadliest conflict for journalists since the Committee to Protect Journalists started recording in the 1990s or something. You know, Iraq, I think, was the deadliest conflict for journalists since World War II, so that gives you a sense of how deadly this has been. There are different arguments, I'd say motivated arguments on either side for why that is. Defenders of Israel would say it's because, you know, Hamas hides in civilian centers, and so, you know, and Israel has to bomb them. What's your sense of why this conflict has been so deadly for journalists, as someone who has reported on the ground there?
I mean, this is a very small strip of land, completely blockaded, land, sea and air. There's no way out for civilians in Gaza. And what we keep hearing from the Israeli military is these evacuation orders for civilians to move to so-called safe zones. These safe zones aren't safe. They're not humanitarian zones. We've seen them struck multiple times. They are very small. And for many civilians in Gaza, they've been told to move time and time again for almost a year now. There's nowhere left to go. We've been hearing that from the UN repeatedly now. So when we hear these sort of claims of targeted attacks or targeted strikes on Hamas infrastructure or terror targets, as the Israeli military terms it, it's almost impossible to avoid civilian casualty, especially when you're using 2,000-pound bombs. I mean, in any conflict, that would be obvious, but particularly in a tiny strip of land like Gaza, where there's simply no way out. And what we've seen in previous conflicts, of course, is the subsequent effects of a refugee crisis. You see civilians being pushed out into neighboring countries or to neighboring areas where they can find safety, although, of course, it's not an ideal situation. That's not possible in Gaza. Right. And we also kind of keep hearing this notion from the Israeli government and from the Israeli military and others as well, that, you know, well, why doesn't Egypt take them? Why doesn't Jordan take them? When you speak to Palestinians on the ground, they don't want to leave. This is their home. They're
not Egyptian, first of all.
Exactly.
And they understandably have a very understandable historical reasons, are very averse to leaving their land because they know what happens when they do.
Absolutely. And, you know, so many of the civilians living in Gaza are themselves refugees who were forced out in 1948 from their homes in other parts of what is now Israel. And, you know, when we look at what's happening in the West Bank as well, we've heard from the UN, we've heard from Amnesty International describing the situation there as akin to apartheid. I mean, it's unimaginable, the experience, but also what is the alternative? So, yes, the civilian casualty is, or death toll rather, is extremely, extremely high. At this point, I think the latest figures are just over 41,000. But again, there are tens of thousands still unaccounted for, missing.
Right.
I mean,
what did you make of that argument that we saw at the beginning of the bombing campaign that I think has waned a little bit by now? But there was this argument that was very, very popular in the United States that the death toll could not be relied upon because it was from the health ministry in Gaza, which is ostensibly run by Hamas. And the Israelis have long denied it. They say that they've killed, I don't know what the number is, 18,000 Hamas terrorists or something like that. But they will not give a figure for how many have died total or how many civilians they've killed. When you're approaching this as a CNN journalist, obviously CNN is a major outlet. Comes under a lot of scrutiny. How do you approach reporting on the death toll, and what do you make of claims that the death toll is somehow inflated? Yeah,
I mean, there has been a lot of debate around the phrasing of how we report on the death toll. Right. A lot of media organizations initially began with reporting it as, you know, the death toll according to the Hamas-run health ministry. And there was a lot of discussion around that, a lot of debate around that, internally, externally, you know, a lot of discussion, which you need to have on any story. And And we've moved away from that now. And I think that's important because the initial sort of phrasing really cast doubt on the death toll,
right,
in just the way you say it. What we know from speaking to humanitarian organizations, including UN agencies, is that they have worked with the health ministry in Gaza for years now, and that the figures that they have provided in previous conflicts, the figures that they have provided in any instance really, has always been reliable. So if the UN is willing to accept these figures as fact, if other humanitarian organizations, reputable humanitarian organizations, are willing to accept this as fact, then there really isn't a reason for us to doubt this. And it's important to remember, of course, that just as we have accusations that Hamas will have an agenda for perhaps inflating the figures, the Israeli military would also have an agenda, a reason to not recognize those figures. But what's also important to remember as well is that, yes, Hamas has an armed wing, and we have seen, horrific attacks carried out by Hamas, including, of course, the October 7th attack. We've seen rocket attacks as well. But Hamas has also been the main governing authority in Gaza now since 2006. It has functioned as a government in Gaza. So it has run the health ministry, the education ministry, all the ministries alongside UN agencies now for almost 2 decades, or over 2 decades. So to cast doubt on that really kind of fails to recognize the role that Hamas plays in Gaza, whether you like it or not.
An administrative role,
exactly,
really. Yeah. Not to mention, I think I've also seen reporting that the Israeli intelligence, privately at least, confirms the death toll.
Yeah.
So you've done all this incredible and oftentimes harrowing reporting on this conflict. You've covered unthinkable instances of child malnutrition. You've witnessed people dealing with losing their children.
Yeah.
Is there a particular moment that sticks out to you in your reporting as indicative of the severity of the humanitarian crisis that we've seen over the last year?
I mean, it's all awful. And it just feels like it's getting worse and worse. And
I should note that you've covered other conflicts before in your career, and does this one feel different in that regard?
Absolutely. And when I speak to my colleagues who have done this job decades longer than I have and covered many, many wars, I mean, none of them have seen anything like this.
Really?
And just to go back to sort of the work that our colleagues are doing in Gaza, we're seeing it secondhand. We're not there. And when I watch this footage, it feels like it's getting worse and worse. And I remember the siege on Al-Shifa Hospital. I think it was 14 days that there was a siege around the area surrounding the hospital. And once that siege was lifted, once people were able to get back and journalists were able to get in there, the footage that we received was horrifying. I can still picture it and I still think about it. And to see something that awful and for there to be no resolution at this point, for there to be no action, is hard to really think about. And what we've seen since then is a deterioration in terms of the humanitarian situation, particularly when it comes to malnutrition and famine now spreading across Gaza. Hearing from mothers who are unable to feed their children, unable to breastfeed as well because they are now severely malnourished, newborns being born severely malnourished. And also, of course, the difficulties in getting aid in. Speaking to aid workers who are saying, we have these trucks lined up. We have so much aid that we want to bring into Gaza and we can't do it. And then the challenges they face in trying to actually distribute the aid within Gaza, the security concerns. I mean, we're seeing aid workers being killed inside Gaza, trying to provide support to those in need. I mean, this is an unimaginable situation, with the added challenge of there being a blockade enforced by the Israeli military and the Israeli government. And no hope of a ceasefire. Yeah. I mean, it feels unimaginable. It feels hopeless. And reporting on this for now almost a year, it's difficult to think that we've been talking about this. We've been talking about the deteriorating humanitarian situation for this long, and for there to be no action is difficult.
Right. Now, I want to go back to the beginning of how you got into covering this. You were born and raised in England. Mm-hmm. What made you want to be a journalist? What made you want to do international reporting?
I think it was definitely the Arab Spring. I was 16 when the Arab Spring kicked off, and instantly, my family is originally from Libya, so there was a definite personal connection to that. Right. We were sort of glued to the news, watching what was happening there, and I was just like, that's what I want to do, you know. And it was about that time that everyone was kind of getting on Twitter as well, or X now, and you know, there was a whole new sort of frontier to journalism as well. So that really attracted me to the profession. But you know, international news has always been my focus and something I've wanted to do, particularly as someone who comes from the Middle East. I mean, growing up, the news felt like it was almost always about the Middle East, wars in the Middle East, political dramas in the Middle East. And you know, watching the news, particularly growing up in the UK, watching British and even American news, you know, hearing reports about the Middle East being told in a way that I felt, you know, didn't necessarily reflect the reality on the ground, or didn't fully understand or appreciate the cultural dynamics or, you know, the historical context of the Middle East. And that kind of, you know, drove me to want to be part of it.
Do you think that because I think that's a really interesting point about how the West covers the Middle East. Yeah. Do you think that, and you know, the Western media gets a lot of criticism, particularly for how they cover Israel and Palestine. Yeah. And in the wake of the October 7th attack, there's a lot of criticism that there was an overt bias towards Israel. And there's also criticism on the other side that there's a bias against Israel. CNN's not immune to those criticisms. No major news network is. Sometimes CNN has been a central focus of it. Do you think that those criticisms are sometimes valid, and do you think that the media is doing a better job now, a year into this conflict, than they were at the beginning?
I mean, with any story, it's impossible to cover it perfectly. And I think it's important to be able to have these open discussions and debates. And we've certainly had them at CNN, you know, discussions around how we can improve our reporting, whether it's on the sort of smaller details of day-to-day coverage or the broader picture of, you know, where we're going with this story.
Right, because the words you use in a headline and the framing of a story can cause outrage on either side. It's
and rightly so. I mean, our stories have impact, have consequences.
Yeah.
So it is important to have those discussions with any story, not just this story. And it's you know, healthy to be able to have these discussions within a newsroom. So that's great that we can have these debates and, you know, try to improve our reporting. And I think over the course of the year, many media outlets have faced criticism, including CNN. I think if anyone were to watch our coverage, you know, overall as a whole, it's very clear that there has been a lot of effort to be balanced and to kind of show both sides and to show the broader picture. And I think that was one of the main challenges I faced kind of coming into this story in October was, you know, I felt that there was such a need to get more context into this. And I think that's still a challenge that many media organizations face because, of course, we're so focused on dealing with the immediacy of breaking news that sometimes we forget that there is a whole lot of historical context that goes into a story that's so important to understanding the story. And I feel that a lot as someone from the Middle East because, you know, you speak to anyone from the Middle East, you kind of grow up talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict with your family. I mean, it's a huge topic. Everyone knows about it, and it's very important to, you know, the Arab community. It's you know, it's a very important issue. So you kind of grow up with that historical context and knowledge, and it's something that I focused a lot on at university and school. Yeah. So for me, it felt like coming into this story, it was like, okay, this is the breaking news situation, but this didn't happen out of the blue. We need to talk about, you know, what led to this.
Right.
And it's been a challenge. You know, we're a 24-hour news network. We're always dealing with breaking news. But I think, at least I hope, a lot of the work that we've been doing has kind of given that context and kind of given both sides. And
those feelings about the way the Western media covers this conflict, did that make your job hard on the ground sometimes? Was it hard to get people to trust you and to...
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, we faced real challenges in Jordan, for example, where trust in Western media was at an all-time low. Yeah. And people didn't want to speak to us because we were from CNN, and I found that really difficult. My team was, you know, myself, my producer who's Palestinian, and, you know, we both speak Arabic, and we're speaking to people in Amman in Arabic, and they were like, oh, CNN? No. And that's changed now, thankfully. Right. In fact, we get people stopping us on the street and saying, you guys are doing a great job. Like,
all right.
But it's that trust in media overall, you know, is at a low, regardless of the story.
Yeah.
In mainstream media, rather.
And social media is a big part of that.
Absolutely, and especially when you're seeing things on social media and you're like, okay, why am I not seeing this on the news? Or why is it not on the news as soon as I'm seeing it on social media? But again, it's both sides. And I find it difficult as well, as somebody who is Arab and, visibly Muslim as well, there's also on the other side an assumption that, for some people, you can't be objective, or that you have an inherent bias towards one side of the conflict. And you don't necessarily have that with, your, let's say, white male colleagues reporting at the White House.
Of course, yeah.
Right? It's, that's never really a question, but as soon as you kind of put me in the Middle East, it's like, oh.
Has there been a problem with access to, and just the way that the ability for you to do reporting in Israel?
Yeah.
Does the fact that you wear a hijab, has that been an issue? Do you think that has any influence on how you're able to do your job there?
Thankfully, it hasn't been a huge issue in Israel. And I mean, I think a large part of that is that we have an excellent team in Jerusalem that I'm always lucky to work with there. So, you kind of bypass those issues somewhat. But again, going out into the street, there's always the added security questions or concerns around, the environment that you're in. But that's with any story and with any country, you kind of have to gauge that. But thankfully, it hasn't been a huge obstacle there.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, when you're going on one of these reporting trips, what's the process to prepare for that? What are you packing? Like, what do you...
I mean, usually they're very last minute deployments. So it's a mad dash.
You get the word, and within a couple hours you have to be on a flight.
Yes.
Really?
So it's just, quickly pack everything.
So it's whatever goes in a backpack.
Throw everything in a backpack.
Okay.
Yeah. And, nowadays, especially with the Middle East, it's, all the body armor and medical kit.
Yeah.
Laptop, and then whatever else I can squeeze in.
Now, given it's been so dangerous, are you taking extra precautions, or does that
we have
worry
to.
you more than it would covering something else?
It doesn't worry me. Especially working with CNN, you're working with colleagues who've been doing this for years. I'm very lucky to get to work with such experienced producers and photojournalists and others, and that's great. But that's kind of the dangers come with the job, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think there's anyone in the newsroom who would be like, oh, can't go to Lebanon, it's a bit scary right now.
Right.
It's a big story.
And I think one of the good things about CNN is, obviously, as I mentioned, you have this big international footprint. Does it worry you that forces like social media, the economic challenges that big media organizations are facing, that poses a threat to the ability of big authoritative news networks to deliver reporting on the ground from these places? Is that something that you're concerned about?
I think we need to definitely shift the way we're covering these big stories. I think we are shifting the way we cover these big stories, particularly because of social media. There's a huge shift towards that and focusing more on how we can deliver our reporting in a different way that people might actually appreciate more than sort of linear TV coverage. We've definitely found that with our Israel-Gaza coverage. My reporting, I feel like I can reach more people on Instagram and on X, on TikTok, whatever it is. And that's where people are getting their news. That's where people are seeing these raw videos firsthand. So you
and also imagine like CNN has to integrate those videos into its coverage in a way that has never been done before in a war.
And it's shifting quite quickly at CNN. And I think everyone's really on board with that. It's the way I consume news. It's the way other people consume news. So for CNN not to want to be a part of it would be weird. And
What do you think the world doesn't appreciate or understand about this war, from just based on your coverage of it? And forgive me for a broad question. It's probably quite hard to answer.
To go back to what we were talking about earlier, I think it is, for me, all about the context and the history. And I think without an understanding of what came before this, what led to this, it's very difficult to understand the dynamics of what is happening, of why this is such a contentious conflict, of why this is a hugely important issue for Palestinians across the globe, not just in Gaza, not just in the occupied West Bank, and why this is going to have such huge implications for the dynamics in the region in the years to come as well. Anyone who's been following what's been happening in Gaza and the occupied West Bank, and more broadly the Israel-Palestine conflict over the last few decades, this did not happen in a vacuum. And we've been hearing from human rights organizations repeatedly now for years prior to this war around the persecution of Palestinians, around fears of an apartheid system being enforced in the West Bank, around the situation in the West Bank when it comes to the occupation and when it comes to the expansion of settlements. those warning signs have been there, and that is in no way to justify the actions of Hamas on October 7th, of course. But again, to assume that that happened in a vacuum is very, it's short-sighted. You need to understand the context, and I think that's a huge challenge for media organizations as well, to be able to bring in that history and that context in our reporting. And it's difficult to do that in a breaking news situation. And when we're talking about Lebanon now as well, to kind of bring in the history of the country and the challenges Lebanon has faced over the last few decades, in the last few years even, the economic crisis, the port blast. I mean, these are all issues which are so inherently important to the Lebanese people as well, and then to be going through yet another war. So I think in terms of the broader conflict, without that context, you don't have a full understanding of what is happening.
Right, and I think unfortunately that context is why people will often say, oh, this issue is very complicated.
Yes.
Which is often used as a way to not discuss it.
Favorite.
Yes. Is that something that you try to overcome in your reporting?
Yes.
By explaining to people, that may have a complicated history or a long history with a lot of different aspects to it, but it's actually not that complicated as a story.
No, it's not.
And it's important to be able to convey that to viewers.
Yeah, absolutely. And to have all the facts and to have all the information about, what the reality is on the ground. And I think that's a challenge that we've faced, and, we've been talking about it within CNN, of how we can better reflect what life is like for a Palestinian living in the occupied West Bank, what life is like for Palestinians living within Israel as well. And the dynamics there between Israelis and Palestinians, and this assumption as well that, it's all bad as well. I was there speaking in Israel, speaking to activists who don't want to see a war, who want to see a ceasefire, who don't want to see Palestinians being persecuted, who don't want to see an expansion of settlements. There are a huge variety of different dynamics and layers to not only this conflict, but also to life in Israel-Palestine. And I think there's almost a fear around the discussion of the realities on the ground. People don't want to talk about the realities of what it means for a people to be occupied. No one wants to talk about that. People don't want to talk about the realities of a potential apartheid system. And there's a feeling of, this is too complicated, it's too sensitive, you don't want to offend the wrong people, you don't want to get into, this huge debate. But we need to have those debates. Right. We need to have those discussions, and we need to be able to have those discussions openly and without fear, not only within news organizations where it's crucial, but also just with, your broader colleagues, your friends, your family, to be able to have that discussion. Which
I think that's why we had an enormous amount of hand-wringing about the college campus protests here in the United States, when obviously much worse things are happening overseas.
Yeah.
But I think that all plays into that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And even with the college campus protests,
what did you make of that?
We've seen college campus protests.
We have.
For many different causes.
Not a new thing.
It's definitely not a new thing. It's not a new thing, and the vast majority of these protests, of these encampments, were peaceful. Were sending out an anti-war message, calling for a ceasefire. We saw a huge amount of diversity at these college campus protests. From different communities, different walks of life, including Arabs, Muslims, Jews, and a whole array of other demographics. And there was this sort of, instant assumption that these were bad and violent, and, just a failure to listen to what these protesters were calling for. And I found it very difficult to watch and hear sort of coverage around these protests, and to think about, generations before us protesting apartheid in South Africa, and students who, the student movement around that was huge.
And there were people at the time who said that they were extremists. And
yeah, exactly. And what we saw firsthand, and our teams were on the ground speaking to students on the ground as well, in their own reporting, saying, look, these are peaceful protests. These students want an end to the war. They want to see a ceasefire. And sure, universities have to deal with this on their own terms, but as someone who was a student not too long ago, it's kind of an essential part of student life, right?
It's what you're supposed to do, yeah. Where are you up to next? Do you know?
I do not know, but it will most likely be somewhere in the Middle East, and it will most likely be short notice.
Nada Bashir, thank you so much for coming on Press Club. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.